Chapter 1. The empty house king Cassian Thorne came home late, the way he always did, past midnight, the corridors of Ashgrove Keep lit only by the low amber glow of the wall sconces that the night staff kept burning for him, the rest of the household long since asleep. It had been a council session that ran long, again border disputes with the Veyra territories, 3 hours of arguing over grazing rights that should have taken 30 minutes. And Cassian had stayed because he always stayed, because that was what a king did, because the alternative was leaving the work for tomorrow, and tomorrow always had its own work waiting. He didn't think about it. He never thought about it, not really, not the lateness, not the pattern, not the fact that this was the 4th night this week and the 11th this month. It was simply how things were. How they had been for 2 years now, since the war on the northern border had ended and the rebuilding had begun, and Cassian Thorne, Alpha King of Ashgrove, had discovered that there was always more to do. He climbed the stairs to the private wing, already half thinking about tomorrow's correspondence, already composing the apology he'd give Leura in the morning. "I'm sorry, love. The Veyra delegation again. You know how they are." The same apology more or less that he'd given 100 times before, and that she had, 100 times before. Accepted with a tired smile and a kiss on the cheek and a quiet, "I know. Go to sleep, Cassian." The door to their chambers was closed. Cassian pushed it open quietly, the way he always did, careful not to wake her. The room was dark. And still. And empty. Not she's already asleep empty. Not she's in the bathing room empty. Empty, the bed made, untouched. The wardrobe doors standing slightly open with gaps where dresses should have hung. The small writing desk by the window cleared of the little collection of pressed flowers and half-finished letters that had lived there for as long as Cassian could remember. For a long moment, Cassian simply stood in the doorway, his mind refusing to assemble the pieces into anything that made sense. Then he saw the letter on the bed, a single folded page, sealed with plain wax, no royal crest, just Leora's small, careful handwriting across the front. Cassian. His hands were not quite steady when he picked it up. "Cassian, I have tried to write this letter a dozen times, and every version sounded like an accusation, and I don't want it to be an accusation, because I don't think you've ever done anything wrong, exactly. That's almost the hardest part. I'm going to stay with my sister for a while. Not forever. I don't know how long. I just need to be somewhere that I'm not waiting. I know you'll read this and think of all the reasons it isn't your fault. The war, the rebuilding, the council, all of it real. All of it important. I'm not writing this to argue with any of that. I just need you to understand something, and I don't think I can say it to your face without one of us getting angry. So I'm writing it instead. 2 years ago, I married a man who used to fall asleep talking to me about nothing. Just because he didn't want the day to end yet. Somewhere in the last 2 years, I started being married to an empty side of the bed and a closed study door. And I kept telling myself it was temporary. It would get better once the border settled, once the harvest was secured, once the trade routes reopened. And it never got better, Cassian. It just became normal. And I don't know how to keep being someone's wife when most days. I'm the only one who remembers that I am one. I'm not angry. I want you to know that, truly, I just think, if I stayed I would either start being angry, or I would stop noticing that I was lonely at all, and I'm not sure which of those frightens me more. Please don't send anyone after me. I just need some time. Leora. Cassian read the letter twice. Then, a third time. By the 4th time, his hands had started shaking properly, and he sat down heavily on the edge of the bed. Their bed, the one she'd just described as empty, and he thought, with a kind of sick clarity, she's right. It has been empty. For longer than I want to admit. He thought about the last time he'd actually talked to Leora, not exchanged pleasantries, not received her tired smile in the doorway as he came in or went out, but talked, the way they used to, late into the night about nothing and everything. He tried to find the memory and realized with growing horror that he couldn't place it. Weeks. It had been weeks, at least. Maybe longer. When had that happened? When had it become normal to come home to a sleeping wife, or an empty room, and feel nothing but relief that he hadn't woken her? That he didn't have to find the energy for conversation? That he could just fall into bed and be asleep before his thoughts caught up to him? She's been alone in this for months, he thought, and the thought arrived with the force of a physical blow. She's been alone in this marriage for months, and I didn't even notice, because I was too busy being a good king to notice I'd stopped being a good husband. Chapter 2, the Council of Two. Cassian did not sleep that night. He sat in the dark with Leora's letter in his hands, and he thought, really thought, for the first time and longer than he wanted to examine, about the last 2 years. He thought about the early days of their marriage, before the Northern War had reignited, The way Leora used to wait up for him not out of duty but because she genuinely wanted to hear about his day. The way they used to take walks through the keep's gardens at dawn because it was the only time they were both reliably free. The way she'd laugh at his terrible jokes about the council members, and he'd laugh at her terrible jokes about him. About how seriously he took everything. About how he organized his sock drawer by color like that was a normal thing for an Alpha King to do. He thought about the war. 3 brutal years of it. Border raids and supply lines, and the gut-twisting work of sending wolves out to fight, and waiting to find out how many came back. He thought about how Leora had been the one steady thing through all of it. How she'd run the keep's relief efforts, organized the wounded soldiers' care, written letters to grieving families in her own hand because she said a stamped seal felt cold, and these families deserved better than cold. He thought about how, even in the worst of the war, they'd still found time for each other. Late nights, yes. But late nights together, even if together just meant her reading by the fire while he worked through reports. Occasionally reading him a line that made her laugh. And then the war had ended. And Cassian had thought, genuinely, foolishly thought, that things would get easier now. That the hardest part was over. He hadn't accounted for what came after a war, the rebuilding, the negotiations, the endless, grinding work of stitching a kingdom back together, resettling displaced packs, renegotiating a dozen treaties that had lapsed during the fighting, rebuilding the border garrisons, managing a council full of wolves who'd spent 3 years deferring to wartime authority and were now, in peacetime, eager to reassert their opinions on everything. It had felt, every single day, like there was more work than there had been during the war, except now there was no excuse for it. No enemy at the gate to justify the late nights. Just an endless list of important things, each one slightly more important than the last, each one just barely justifying one more late evening, one more missed dinner, one more night where Leora had gone to bed before he got home. One more night. Cassian thought, staring at the letter, repeated 300 times, until it became a marriage. He thought about something his father had told him once, years ago, before he died, back when Cassian was a young heir, frustrated at how much time his father spent in council instead of with him and his sister. A king's first duty is to his kingdom, his father had said, and at the time, young Cassian had taken it as wisdom. Now, sitting in an empty bedroom with his wife's goodbye letter in his hands, Cassian thought about that sentence differently. He thought about his father, who had died of a heart that simply gave out at 53, having spent 30 years putting the kingdom first in every single decision, including, Cassian remembered this now, with a clarity he'd never had before, including the decision to work through his own wife's final illness, because there had been a treaty signing that couldn't wait, and by the time he'd finished it, she was gone, and he'd missed it. A king's first duty is to his kingdom, his father had said. And Cassian, sitting alone in the dark, thought, maybe that's exactly the problem. Maybe that's the lesson I should have questioned, instead of inherited. By dawn, Cassian had made a decision. It wasn't a complicated one. In the end, it had just taken him an entire sleepless night to arrive at something that, in retrospect, seemed obvious. He was going to go after her. Not to drag her back. Not to insist she return, or to lecture her about duty, or to remind her of vows in a way that turned her own pain into an obligation. Leora had asked him not to send anyone after her, and Cassian understood, with a clarity that hurt, exactly why. She wasn't asking to be rescued. She was asking for space. Because space was the one thing 2 years of marriage to him hadn't given her. But Cassian also knew, with equal clarity, that he was not going to spend the next however many weeks sitting in this empty keep, attending council sessions, pretending that nothing in his life had just fundamentally broken. If Leora needed time and space, fine, she would have it. But Cassian was not going to spend that time the way he'd spent the last 2 years, buried in work. Telling himself it was temporary. Telling himself it would get better once the next crisis passed. He was going to go to her sister's territory, not to find Leora, not yet. Not unless she wanted to be found, but to be near. To make it clear, by his presence and his actions rather than his words, that something had changed. And in the meantime, he was going to do something he hadn't done in longer than he could remember. He was going to hand the kingdom to someone else for a while. Chapter 3. The regent you want to do what? Lord Brynns, Cassian Seneschal, and the man who had, for the past 2 years, functioned as something between an advisor and a second pair of hands for the kingdom's administration, looked at Cassian across the breakfast table with an expression of such profound confusion that, on any other morning, Cassian might have found it funny. I want to appoint a regent, Cassian said. Temporarily while I'm away. Away where? That's not important right now. Cassian had spent the morning composing what he was going to say, and he found, now that the moment had arrived, that the words came easier than he'd expected. Easier, perhaps, because for the first time in 2 years, he was completely certain about what he wanted. Bryns, I need you to be honest with me about something, and I need you to not soften it just because I'm the king. All right. How long has it been obvious that things weren't well? Between Leora and me, Bryns was quiet for a long moment, long enough that Cassian's stomach sank before the man even spoke. Sire, Bryns said carefully, with respect, I think most of the household staff noticed before either of you did. The Queen used to wait in the receiving hall most evenings, in case you came home early. She stopped doing that, I want to say, 8 months ago? Maybe longer. She started having dinner sent to her chambers instead of the dining hall, because the dining hall felt, her words, to one of the kitchen staff, too big for one person. He hesitated. I considered, more than once, whether it was my place to say something to you. I never quite found the courage. I'm sorry for that, sire. Cassian closed his eyes briefly. 8 months. 8 months of his wife eating dinner alone in their chambers because the dining hall felt too big, and he hadn't noticed. He'd been home during some of those dinners, late, but home, and he hadn't noticed. You don't need to apologize, he said finally. It wasn't your job to fix my marriage, Bryns, it was mine, and I didn't, and that's on me. He took a breath. Which is why I need a regent. Bryns, I trust you more than almost anyone in this kingdom, and I think you're more than capable of running the day-to-day administration for a few weeks. Council sessions, correspondence, the routine business. I'll leave instructions for anything that genuinely can't wait, and a way for you to reach me if something truly urgent comes up. But Bryns, I need you to understand something. For the next while, nothing is going to be urgent enough to interrupt me unless it's an active threat to the kingdom's safety. Trade disagreements, council squabbles, scheduling disputes, none of that. Not anymore. Bryns studied him for a long moment, and something in his weathered face shifted. Understanding, Cassian thought, and maybe a little relief, like a man who'd been waiting a long time for someone else to say what he hadn't dared to. Sire, Bryns said slowly, can I say something, and you won't hold it against me? Go ahead. I think this is the wisest decision I've seen you make in 2 years. And I think, for what little it's worth, I think Her Majesty would agree if she knew you were the one who decided it, not because someone told you to. Because you decided it yourself. Cassian managed something that was almost a smile. Let's hope so, Bryns. Let's hope so. Chapter 4. The long ride. The journey to Lady Marin's territory, Leora's elder sister, who'd married into the Caldwell pack on Ashgrove's southern border, took 4 days by horse, and Cassian made the entire trip with only 2 guards. Traveling light, in clothes plain enough that he was mistaken, twice, for a merchant's escort. He didn't mind. If anything, the anonymity was a relief. 4 days with nothing to do but ride and think. No council reports waiting at the end of each day, no correspondence to review by candlelight, just road and sky and his own thoughts, which had a great deal to say once he finally gave them room to speak. He thought about the early days again, but more specifically, this time, about what had been different about them. It wasn't that he'd had less work, back then. If anything, the early days of his reign had been chaotic. A young king finding his feet. A council still testing the edges of his authority. The early tremors of the border conflict that would eventually become a full war. There had always been work. There had always been more to do than time to do it in. The difference, Cassian realized somewhere on the second day of writing, wasn't the amount of work. It was that, back then, he'd treated his marriage as something that existed alongside the work, a part of his life that had its own claim on his time, its own priority, that he protected the same way he protected council sessions or border patrols. Somewhere along the way, gradually, so gradually he'd never noticed the shift happening, his marriage had stopped being something he protected, and become something he assumed would simply be there, waiting whenever he had time left over. And the thing about whenever there's time left over, Cassian thought grimly, was that there was never ever time left over. Work expanded to fill every available hour, because work always could. The only things that ever got protected were the things you actively, deliberately chose to protect. And Cassian had stopped choosing 2 years ago, without ever realizing he'd made a choice at all. That's what I have to fix, he thought, on the 3rd day, as the road wound down through hill country toward the Caldwell territory. Not spend more time with Leora when I can. Choose to. Every day. The way I used to. It sounded simple, put that way. Cassian suspected it would not feel simple at all, once he was back in Ashgrove and the council sessions resumed and the work piled up the way it always did. But he thought, he hoped, that the difference between intention and habit was exactly the difference between the man who'd let 2 years slip away without noticing, and the man he wanted to be now. Hashtag Chapter 5. The Caldwin Lodge Lady Marin's home turned out to be a sprawling timber lodge at the edge of a lake, surrounded by pine forest so thick and green it felt like a different world from Ashgrove's stone halls and formal gardens. Cassian arrived in the late afternoon of the fourth day, sent his guards to wait at the village inn a mile back. He wanted, for this part, to be alone, and walked the last stretch of road on foot, his heart hammering in a way it hadn't before council sessions, before battles, before anything in years. He found Marin first, Leora's sister, a tall woman with the same dark hair and the same direct way of looking at people, standing on the lodge's porch with an expression that suggested she'd been watching the road for exactly this possibility. "Cassian," she said. "Not your majesty, just his name, flat and assessing." "Marin." He stopped at the bottom of the porch steps, not presuming to come closer. "I'm not here to take her back. I want you to know that. Before anything else. I needed her to know that I understand. What I did. What I let happen. And I didn't want to say it in a letter. Because letters are easy, and I don't want this to be easy." Marin studied him for a long moment, long enough that Cassian genuinely didn't know which way it would go. Then she said, "She's down by the lake. Has been most evenings since she got here. Says it's the only place quiet enough to think." A pause. "She's not expecting you, Cassian. If this goes badly, I want you to leave when she asks you to. No arguments, no just 5 more minutes. Understood?" "Understood, then go on." Marin nodded toward a path that wound down through the pines, toward the glint of water beyond. "And Cassian," she added, as he started down the path, "for what it's worth, she's missed you. Don't let that make you complacent. Missing someone and being ready to trust them again aren't the same thing." Leora was sitting on a flat rock at the lake's edge, knees drawn up, watching the last light spread gold and pink across the water, and for a long moment, Cassian simply stood at the edge of the trees and looked at her. Really looked. The way he hadn't, he realized, in longer than he wanted to admit. The way the breeze caught loose strands of her dark hair. The particular set of her shoulders, relaxed in a way he hadn't seen in months. Here, away from a keep that had apparently stopped feeling like home to her. He thought about turning back. About giving her this evening, this peace, and finding another time. But he thought of Marin's words. Missing someone and being ready to trust them again aren't the same thing. And understood, with sudden clarity, that if he turned back now, out of fear of the conversation, he would be doing exactly the thing he'd come here to stop doing. Choosing the easier path. Telling himself there'd be a better time later. He stepped out from the trees. Leora heard him. He saw her shoulders go rigid, saw her turn. Saw the moment recognition crossed her face, followed by something far more complicated, surprise and wariness, and underneath it, something that might have been hope, carefully guarded. "Cassian," she didn't stand. "I asked you not to send anyone." "I didn't send anyone," Cassian said quietly. "I came myself. Alone, well, 2 guards, but they're a mile back at the village and I asked them to stay there." He stayed where he was, several paces away, not crowding the space between them. "Leora, I'm not here to ask you to come home. I want to be clear about that. Right away. Because I think it matters. I'm here because..." He took a breath. "Because I read your letter about 50 times. And every time, it got harder to read. Because every time, I understood a little more of what you were actually saying, underneath the words. And I didn't want you to have to wonder, for however long you needed to be away, whether I understood. I do. I understand, Leora. And I'm sorry. Not in the way I've apologized 100 times before. The I'm sorry, the council ran late way. I'm sorry for 2 years. I'm sorry I let 2 years happen without ever once stopping to ask what it was costing you. Costing us." Leora was quiet for a long moment, watching him with an expression he couldn't quite read in the fading light. "You came all this way to say that?" she said finally. "You could have written it. I could have." Cassian agreed. "But you said in your letter that you didn't think you could say what you needed to say to my face without one of us getting angry, and I understood that. I did. But Leora, I think I needed to say this to your face. Because if I wrote it in a letter, it would be easy. I could write it, send it, and go back to council sessions tomorrow, and tell myself I'd handled it. And I didn't want this to be something I handled. I wanted it to cost me something, the way the last 2 years cost you something. Every single day. And I never even noticed." Hashtag Chapter 6. What comes after I appointed Brynns as regent, Cassian continued, when Leora didn't say anything immediately. "Temporary, but, Leora, I told him nothing short of an actual emergency is to interrupt me. Not council squabbles. Not trade disputes. Nothing that's been eating my evenings for 2 years while I told myself it couldn't wait. He finally took a step closer. Slow, careful, watching her face for any sign that he should stop. I don't know how long you need. And I mean that. I'm not going to ask you to give me a timeline, because I think that would just be another version of asking you to manage my feelings about this, instead of taking care of your own. But I wanted you to know, whenever you're ready, if you're ever ready, there's a version of our life waiting for you that doesn't look like the last 2 years. Because I'm not going back to that version. Not because you're asking me to change. Because I'm asking myself to. And if I'm not ready for a long time? Leora's voice was quiet, but steady. The voice, Cassian thought, of someone who'd had 4 days to think about exactly this question, and wasn't going to pretend otherwise. If I need months, Cassian? The kingdom can't run forever without its king actually being its king. Then it'll take months, Cassian said. Leora, I spent 2 years telling myself the kingdom couldn't run without me handling every single thing personally, and you know what I realized? On the ride here, it can. Brynns has been doing half my job for 2 years without complaint, and he's good at it, and Ashgrove has a council full of capable people who've been waiting for me to actually delegate instead of just delegating the parts I didn't want to do myself while holding on to everything that made me feel important. He stopped, a few feet from her now, close enough to see her eyes properly in the dimming light, and close enough, he thought, that whatever happened next, he wanted her to see his face clearly too. I'm not going to pretend this is a simple fix, Leora. I know, gods, I know, that I've changed my mind about my priorities doesn't undo 2 years of feeling like the only person who remembered you were married. That's not something I can apologize away in one conversation by a lake. But I wanted you to know. I'm not going back to Ashgrove and going straight back to the way things were. Whatever happens between us, whether you come back next week, or next month, or... His voice caught slightly on the possibility he didn't want to say out loud, or not at all. I'm not going to be the man who let that happen again. To you. Or to whoever I'm lucky enough to share my life with. I owe that to you, either way. You taught me that, even if it took losing you to learn it. For a long moment, Leora didn't say anything at all. She looked at him, really looked, the way she used to in the early days, when she'd catch him in the middle of some terrible joke and just look at him like she was trying to memorize something, and Cassian held still and let her look, and didn't fill the silence with anything else, because he'd said what he came to say, and the rest, whatever came next, wasn't his to rush. You walked 4 days, she said finally, to tell me you've appointed a regent and you're planning to delegate more. I walked 4 days, Cassian said, to tell you that I finally understood what you were trying to tell me, not with my head, the way I understood it on the ride here, but with... He gestured vaguely at his own chest, feeling suddenly, helplessly inarticulate, the way he hadn't felt since he was a much younger man, fumbling through their very first conversation. With whatever part of me apparently stopped paying attention 2 years ago. I walked 4 days because I didn't want this to be easy, Leora. I wanted it to be hard. The way the last 2 years were hard for you. Even if it's a fraction of that. Even if it doesn't come close to evening anything out, I needed you to know. That's all. I'm not asking for anything else tonight. Leora was quiet for a long time after that, long enough that the gold light over the lake faded into deep blue, and the first stars came out, scattered and faint, and somewhere behind them, an owl called once, and went silent. Then, slowly, she shifted on the rock, making room. Cassian realized, a beat later than he should have, and said, quietly, sit down. Cassian. You've been standing there so long you're starting to sway. He sat, carefully, leaving space between them, not presuming. I don't know what I want yet, Leora said, after another long moment, looking out at the water rather than at him. I want you to know that too, honestly, not just as something to make you feel better. I came here because I needed to not be waiting for a while, and 4 days isn't enough time to undo 2 years of waiting, even with, she gestured, slightly, at him, at the fact of his being here, even with this. Whatever this is. I know, Cassian said. I'm not asking you to know yet. But, Leora hesitated, and when she continued, her voice was rougher than before, like something in it had finally cracked open after holding steady for a long time. But I will say, in 2 years, Cassian, you have never once said any of what you just said. Not once. You've apologized for specific things, being late, missing a dinner, forgetting an anniversary dinner reservation that one time, but you've never. She stopped, and pressed the back of her hand briefly against her eyes, and Cassian's chest ached with the sudden, fierce wish to reach for her, and the equally fierce certainty that he shouldn't. Not yet. Not unless she reached first. You've never once said I let this happen, and I'm choosing to be different, instead of I'll try to do better next time. I'll try to do better is something you say about a single evening. Cassian, what you just said, that's something you say about a life. I meant it that way, Cassian said quietly. I meant every word of it that way. Leora was quiet again, and then, slowly, hesitantly, she reached out and found his hand in the darkness, and laced her fingers through his, the way she used to, in the early days, on those dawn walks through the gardens. I'm not coming home tomorrow, she said, and there was something almost apologetic in it, even as her hand stayed in his. I think I need at least a few more weeks, Cassian, to make sure this isn't just relief, talking, to make sure it's real. Once you're back in Ashgrove, and the council's pressing, and all the old patterns are right there, ready to pull you back into them. That's fair, Cassian said. More than fair. He hesitated, then added, carefully, can I ask, would it be all right if I wrote to you? Not asking anything of you. Just letters the way we used to, before the war. About nothing. About my terrible jokes and my sock drawer and whatever's growing in the Caldwin Gardens that you've probably already adopted as a personal project. For the first time since he'd stepped out of the trees, Leora laughed. A small, startled sound, but real, and it was the best thing Cassian had heard in longer than he could measure. I'd like that, she said. Letters, about nothing. She squeezed his hand once, and then, gently, let it go. Not a rejection, Cassian understood, but a boundary, clear and kind. And Cassian, go back to the village inn tonight. Don't stay here. Marin's already half convinced I should send you packing on principle, and I'd rather not test that tonight. Understood. Cassian stood, slowly, and looked down at her, at the woman he'd nearly lost without ever noticing she was slipping away, sitting by a lake under a sky full of stars, looking, for the first time in longer than he could remember, like someone who wasn't waiting for anything at all. Leora, he said, as he turned to go. Whatever happens, however long this takes. Thank you. For the letter. For not just disappearing, without telling me why. You could have. Gods know I gave you every reason to think I wouldn't notice for weeks. I thought about it, Leora admitted. But she looked up at him, and in the starlight her expression was soft, and tired, and cautiously, carefully hopeful, all at once. I think some part of me always knew you'd come, if I told you the truth. I just didn't know if the man who came would be the one who'd write me an apology and go straight back to the council chamber, or someone different. She held his gaze for a long moment. I think I'm starting to believe it might actually be someone different, Cassian. I just need some time to be sure. Then I'll write, Cassian said, and I'll wait, and I'll be different in Ashgrove whether or not you're there to see it. Because that's not something I'm doing for you. Not really. It's something I should have been doing for myself, for us, for 2 years. You just, his voice caught, slightly. You're the reason I finally noticed I wasn't. #, Chapter 7. The first letter arrived at the Caldwin Lodge 6 days after Cassian's visit, and Marin, who had appointed herself, with no subtlety whatsoever, the household's official mail sorter for the duration of her sister's stay, handed it over with an expression that was trying very hard to look neutral and not quite managing it. Leora opened it that evening, by the lake, the same flat rock, and found 3 full pages in Cassian's familiar, slightly impatient handwriting, and not a single word about council sessions, treaties, or the Vera territories. Instead, a long, very funny account of an attempt by the keep's head gardener to reorganize the entire formal garden according to a system, which had resulted in the rose beds being arranged by height rather than color, producing what Cassian described as a visual effect best compared to a very confused military parade. A complaint about the sock drawer, apparently in Leora's absence, someone had reorganized it, and Cassian had spent 4 days searching for a particular gray pair before discovering they'd been moved, with what he clearly considered baffling logic, into the drawer with the formal court attire. And, at the very end, a small, careful line. Brynns ran the council session yesterday without me. I went for a walk instead. It felt strange, and then it felt less strange, and I think that's progress. See, Leora read it twice, and found, to her quiet surprise, that she was smiling. She wrote back the next day. The letters became a pattern over the following weeks, not daily, but frequent, full of small things. Leora's account of helping Marin's youngest pup learn to swim, badly, in the lake. Cassian's description of a council session where Lord Ferrand equivalent, Shkruvy, had its own version. A stubborn old wolf named Lord Pell, no relation to anyone in particular, had argued for 40 minutes about seating arrangements at an upcoming diplomatic dinner, and Cassian had, for the first time in 2 years, simply said, Lord Pell, I trust your judgment on this entirely. Please proceed as you see fit," and left the chamber 20 minutes early to go for another walk. "The strange thing," Cassian wrote, in a letter near the end of the 3rd week, "is that nothing has actually gone wrong. I keep waiting for some disaster that proves I was right to never delegate anything, and instead, Bryn's handled the trade dispute with the southern packs better than I would have. He's less stubborn than I am, it turns out, which apparently makes for better negotiating. I think, for 2 years, I convinced myself that being indispensable was the same thing as being a good king. I'm starting to think it might have been the opposite." Leora read that letter 3 times, sitting on the rock by the lake, and found that her eyes had gone unexpectedly damp. Not from sadness, this time, but from something that felt, cautiously, like the early edges of hope. Chapter 8. The walk home. It was nearly 6 weeks after Cassian's visit to the lake when Leora packed a single bag, told Meryn, who had been expecting it, judging by the entirely unsurprised look on her face, that she was going home, and set out for Ashgrove, not by carriage, but on foot, taking the same road Cassian had walked to find her. She arrived at the keep in the late afternoon, 4 days later, dusty and tired and, for the first time in longer than she could remember, not the slightest bit nervous about what she'd find when she got there. She found Cassian in the gardens. Not the formal gardens, the kitchen gardens, at the keep's edge, where Leora had never once, in 2 years of marriage, seen her husband set foot. He was on his knees in the dirt, in plain clothes, with what appeared to be a basket of herbs beside him and an expression of intense, slightly baffled concentration, like a man trying very hard to figure out the difference between a weed and an actual plant, and not entirely succeeding. "You're doing it wrong," Leora said, from the edge of the path. "That's thyme. You just pulled out the thyme." Cassian looked up, and the expression that crossed his face, seeing her there, was something Leora knew she'd remember for the rest of her life. Pure, unguarded, disbelieving joy. The kind of expression a king almost never allowed himself in front of anyone, let alone alone in a kitchen garden with dirt on his hands. Leora, he was on his feet before he seemed to fully decide to stand, crossing the garden in a few long strides, and then stopped, just short of her. The same careful restraint he'd shown by the lake, waiting. "I walked," Leora said, a little breathlessly, suddenly aware of how far she'd come, how long she'd thought about this moment. "The whole way. I don't know, I wanted to arrive the way you did. Tired, and a little ridiculous, and not because anyone sent me. Why are you in the kitchen gardens, Cassian? You hate gardening. You told me, the first year we were married, that you found gardens aggressively unpredictable and refused to come near them." "I started coming out here a few weeks ago," Cassian admitted, "and there was something almost shy in it. After your last letter, the one about Meryn's pup learning to swim, and how you said it reminded you of learning things badly on purpose, just for the joy of doing something new and useless. I thought, I've spent my whole life being good at things, Leora, important things. I thought maybe I should try being bad at something unimportant, for once, and see what that felt like." He gestured, ruefully, at the herb bed, several plants of which were now lying forlornly in a small pile beside him. "Turns out it feels like accidentally murdering the time. But I've been coming out here most evenings. It's quiet. And it gave me something to do with my hands while I thought about you, instead of just working through it, the way I used to work through everything." Leora looked at him, at the king of Ashgrove, kneeling in dirt, ruining an herb garden, looking at her like she was the only thing in the world worth looking at, and felt something in her chest that had been held tight and careful for 2 years finally, completely, let go. "I'm home," she said. "Properly, I mean. Not because I think everything's fixed, Cassian. I think it'll take longer than 6 weeks to be sure of that. But I'm home because I want to be here, while we figure it out. Together, not waiting in a room by myself, wondering if you'll notice I'm gone." "I'll notice," Cassian said, and his voice was rough with something that might have been tears, though he was smiling too widely for Leora to be entirely sure. "Leora, I notice everything now. The weather. The way the light comes through the east windows in the morning. The fact that the kitchen staff make extra of your favorite soup every single day, just in case you come home and want some. I notice everything, now, because I spent 2 years noticing nothing, and I never want to go back to that. Not for one day." He reached out, slowly, the way he had by the lake, and this time, Leora didn't hesitate. She closed the last few feet between them and stepped into his arms, and Cassian held her like he'd been waiting 6 weeks to do exactly that, which, Leora thought, he probably had. "For what it's worth," she murmured, into his shoulder, smelling dirt and crushed herbs and something warmer underneath, something that was simply him, familiar in a way she'd missed more than she'd let herself admit. "The time will probably grow back. It's surprisingly resilient." Cassian laughed, a real laugh, warm and a little disbelieving, The kind she hadn't heard from him in longer than 2 years, she realized. Longer than that. Maybe longer than she wanted to count. "So am I," he said, quietly, against her hair. "Apparently, turns out it just took someone leaving to make me notice." That evening, for the first time in longer than either of them could remember, the King of Ashgrove came home from the council session, on time, with Bryn's having handled the rest of the agenda exactly as arranged to find his wife waiting for him. Not in the receiving hall formally, the way she used to. In the kitchen gardens, in the fading evening light, with 2 cups of mint tea and a herb bed that, despite Cassian's best efforts, had somehow survived his gardening attempts after all. And this time, for the first time in 2 years, Cassian sat down beside her without a single thought for the work waiting on his desk, and stayed.